from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
Welcome to Anti-Tyranny News Radio here on UCY.tv. Thank you for joining me this evening. We're gonna kind of dive into this gun debate again. And we all already know what Trump said. You know, take the guns first, then we'll have due process. Yeah, no. That's not how it's supposed to go here. But they would love that. You know, I'm looking at this article here from Activist Post, and it's got Trump there sitting at the table, it's screenshot, and you got Dianne Feinstein there just happy as can be. Happy as can be. We know what she said, if she could get every, or was that Nancy? Might have been Nancy. Either way, the Democrats have been wanting to seize guns, and they go, oh, well, we're not coming after your guns. We're just going to introduce a bill that affects about 80% of the guns out there. Well, that's going after the guns. If you go after 80% of something, you're going after it. You go after 1% of it, you're going after 1% of it. You can't say that you're not going after it. And, you know, I was thinking too, you know, I'm really not surprised. I hear a lot of teachers going, oh yeah, get rid of the guns, get rid of the guns. And I was like, it kind of reminds me how a school operates. A school operates kind of as an authoritarian style of governing. And because, well, they're children, and you're supposed to, the child should have some type of parent over them. And when the parent's not around, they you know, voluntarily transfer that power to the school. Even though the school overreaches and reaches into things outside of the school environment, well, it'll transfer into the school environment. Okay, we send them there for you to teach them and keep them safe. That's it. You can't control what happens outside of it, and plus that's the parent's responsibility. You're not supposed to indoctrinate them with ideologies. You're supposed to only teach them the facts. That's the problem. We've gone way beyond that. So much that they don't learn much facts anymore. when we start talking about like public schools, I tend to always go back to, you start looking at arithmetic and things from, earlier 1900s, and you look at it and you're like, that's crazy, because what they're learning in, eighth grade here is something they learn when they're seniors or sometimes even in college. And and then they use this too as propaganda, because then you hear them talk, oh, back then, a lot of people only got an eighth grade education. You're lucky, that you get this much education, because they used to only get an eighth grade education. Well, when you go back and look at what type of things they learned, if they passed eighth grade, that would have been kind of in line with, finishing high school nowadays. If not, first semester of college. It's crazy. And then plus the ideologies that tend to come out of the educational systems, whether it even be public school or college. It's unbelievable. You can read this article here at activistpost.com. I'll read a little bit of it. It's titled "Trump and Democrats Agree to Disarm the Public." It says here, U.S. President Donald Trump has flip-flopped from wanting to arm teachers to now siding with Democrats who want to confiscate and ban semi-automatic firearms, violating the Second Amendment of individuals deemed dangerous by the government. In a recent lawmaker conference, Trump proposed confiscation of guns from certain individuals deemed to be dangerous, even if it violates their due process, the Hill reported. Quote, "I like taking the guns early. I like in this crazy man's case that just took place in Florida. To go to court would have taken a long time," Trump said in a meeting with lawmakers on school safety and gun violence. "Take the guns first, go through due process second," Trump said. And you can read the rest of it. It's got the video there too at Activist Post. I really urge you to go read it and just look at the picture. Look at, Dianne Feinstein there. Just take a good look at that. And they say it takes a long time, blah, blah, blah. I don't know about Florida, but I know here in Indiana, it's a red flag state where if they can prove, some type of threat, immediate threat or whatever, they can temporarily disarm you and then take you to court to permanently disarm you, but you really have to prove. But it still doesn't take long. When you look at Nicholas Cruz, you look at it and there was enough there that he should have been arrested. And then before he got out, it should have been deemed by court that any firearms or whatever needed to go. But for whatever reason, let's not do that. The laws were there. He broke, other laws doing it. What have we learned? We need more laws. No, hold on. No. Laws don't stop it. People stop it. Individuals that are willing to intervene and stop violent acts. Prevent violent acts. And there were facts that could have stopped it. This isn't, taking someone's constitutional right. Let's take their guns first and deem them guilty after. No. Before he even had the guns, there should have been enough there to prevent him from buying those guns. You failed at every measure to prevent it. With the laws that are in place that could have prevented it. Don't tell me more laws are going to help. But let's get into this Ron Paul Liberty report about what the president said.
In a position
or
that
might take the firearms first and then go to court, because that's another system. Because a lot of times by the time you go to court, it takes so long to go to court to get the due process procedures. I like taking the guns early, like in this crazy man's case that just took place in Florida. He had a lot of firearms. They saw everything. To go to court would have taken a long time. So you could do exactly what you're saying, but take the guns first, go through due process.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you.
Good to have you back, Dr. Paul.
Oh, very good. It's good to be back and ready and raring to go. Wish we had some very good news for everybody, but we're going to be talking about a problem that came to our attention. We've been talking about school shootings, and the media is, engulfed with it. But there was a major meeting yesterday, at the White House, and the president was there, of course, and he had significant Republicans and significant Democrats. So it was bipartisan, so you can expect our problems to be solved, because as soon as they get together, they come together, and liberty is always promoted when it's bipartisan. Being facetious, obviously, because I think that is the detriment of the country, is too many things are bipartisan, and too often they agree to making things worse, whether it's spending, going to war, or printing more money. This bipartisanship is an endorsement of a bad philosophy, and I think that's what happened yesterday. But I think the shocker was the president came down on the side of more regulation. I believe he's contradicting what he alluded to in his campaign, and he was endorsed by the NRA, I believe, and all of a sudden he's taking on the NRA, conservatives, the Second Amendment, and it's pretty amazing. I cannot see how this is a strategically beneficial move for him, and I think he's wrong politically and constitutionally to say that this is a reason why we have to have more regulations, because sometimes there are bad things that happen. Matter of fact, bad things seem to happen frequently. But putting this in perspective, this isn't, it's not like there's an epidemic that we went through, but there's an epidemic. There's an epidemic of the people who take advantage of this, because when people die, it's very easy to become very emotional and not objective. And when it comes to guns in schools, I think what happens, it really brings out the authoritarian demagogues. Any chance they have to have an answer to a problem with more authoritarianism, more government, less liberty, I think this fits that category.
And there sure were a lot of gasps when he was sitting there. Here's Feinstein on one side, Cornyn from Texas on the other. And he says, you got to get the guns first. Grab the guns first, then we'll worry about due process later. And Feinstein, of course, was giddy. She was giggling. She was thrilled. Cornyn had a pretty stone face, and he's not exactly the most conservative. And then you could say this was kind of a gaffe. He shot from the hip, his instincts, take the guns first, due process later. But even if it was a shot from the hip, even if it was him thinking outside, his mouth running before his brain was running, it does show something that I think you've said all along, which are his instincts. He has authoritarian instincts.
Yeah, and Senator Ben Sasse brought that up to him. He confronted him. He didn't back down. And, of course, he has challenged the president before. But I think his short statement that he made is worth reading, because he was confronting the president right to his face. And this is what Senator Sasse said. He said, quote, "Strong leaders don't automatically agree with the last thing that was said to them. We have the Second Amendment and due process of law for a reason. we're not ditching any constitutional protection simply because the last person the president talked to today doesn't like them. Now, I think the president's been people have accused him of that in the past, but this is pretty serious, and he really catches them here. But it's to me sad that it works that way. He doesn't come from a systematic, fundamental belief in anything. It's all over the place, and it can be both places too. Have it one day one way, one day the next day, and now here's another flip-flop on them. It's interesting to see what this does. He's already announced he wants to be president for another 7 years. So I can't imagine this won't start nibbling away at some of the people that really got excited about him with his populism.
Yeah, you mentioned even early on the political downside of this. I can't imagine. You've got the left is seethes with hatred toward him. And unfortunately, in many cases, irrational hatred, because they don't even talk about his policies. They don't like his hair. They don't like the way he looks. They think that Russia is, under his bed or something. They seethe with hatred. The so-called moderates hate him. A lot of the neocons hate him. The Bill Kristol types hate him. He's got a group of, what Hillary called the deplorables. And he's been their champion, and they've been attracted, and they like guns. Yes. And they're law-abiding people for the most part, too. So undermining that base is politically insane.
And they touched on several specifics, the assault weapons ban, and this whole idea that you take your guns first and due process comes later. That is something else. And, when he made that statement, it reminded me of how the system has worked. What about the NDAA? This authority that's been around, and Trump didn't invent it.
Yeah.
This was in the Bush era. The NDAA, you arrest people, and then Obama extended that. You can kill Americans, assassinate Americans, and deal with the due process later. And sometimes people get arrested, and if you happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you don't get charged, and you don't get a trial, you can get put in prison in Guantanamo or some other place, for life, essentially. So that attitude is very bad, and it's the rejection of the principle that the founding fathers tried to give us regarding guns and defending ourselves. And they weren't wishy-washy. Sometimes liberals will try to say, well, the Second Amendment means that the militia is allowed to own guns, which is a bunch of baloney. It says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Yeah. The purpose being so that you can participate in a militia which provides for your safety and security in a local way. But I think there's been court cases that sort of has refuted that and say it is an individual liberty. But when you come along and get people ready to write these regulations, I think they forget this. And it'll be sad if they have an erosion of that and going back to this thing where they're going to regulate one type of gun without really dealing with the issue of whether or not the people have a right to defend themselves.
Yeah, it's funny, actually, because ironically, Trump was right. Due process, who cares about due process? And you're right, the NDAA is an example. FISA is an example. There's no due process. They just vacuum up all of our communications. How many other examples? So, ironically, he is right. The due process, who cares about it?
He also had a statement about, what about this thing about the police? The cops have the right to stretch the law? Yeah. That, of course, it really invites a lot of problems, too.
We already have those kinds of problems, and I think he suggested that the police should have leeway above and beyond what the law gives them to take away people's guns if they think that person is a bad person. Yeah. So that is dangerous.
I think the other assumption is that the big picture is who's responsible for safety. And our country has gotten to the point where it's the government's job to make us safe and secure. That you have a safety net and you are protected. There's a policeman on every corner, and we're all going to be safe and secure. But, if you carry that through, and many of them do, just think of how many things that they have on their plate. Because it looks to me like there's not the crisis that we have is serious, and you can't belittle it. But compared to even assaults and killing in schools, it hasn't been getting worse.
Yeah, and this is something that's interesting. This came out just a couple of days ago, February 26th. It's a study by James Allen Fox, who's a professor of criminology, law, and public policy at Northeastern University, and he just simply looked at statistics. And he gave a list, people can look it up, a list of where he went for statistics, and he discovered that school shootings have actually been on a steady decline since the 1990s. So there's a lot of hype in the press, for a reason, for propaganda reason. But he said there 4 times the number of children were killed in schools in the early 90s than are killed now in schools. And he also found that more kids are killed in bicycle accidents and pool drownings than shootings. So this is being exploited.
And there was no increase when assault weapons were legalized.
Yeah, because Columbine, I guess, was when the assault weapons were illegal and didn't have any effect.
The whole thing. But it's Pandora's box, really, is what they open up when government's there to make us safe and secure. What if you come up with a statistic to show that a lot of people get killed when they drive their automobiles over 60 miles an hour, in a theoretical sense? If that were the case, why wouldn't the answer be to put a governor on the car? Don't let anybody drive over 60 miles an hour. By that time, the people would probably rebel. Yeah. That's going too far.
Especially in Texas.
I don't think we need that much safety around here. But there are so many things that government does get involved in. They're always involved in nutritional advice, and it's always a disaster. Since the Food and Drug Administration been around, we've had worse foods put on the marketplace, and it's the private market, the holistic type people who introduces the notions to some of the nutritional product. What if they decided sugar was bad for us? Which for some people it's bad for us. But what do we do? We give protectionism to sugar so that we keep the cheap sugar out, and we get in there, we get involved in the sugar business, and then a lot of people suffer the consequences. There are so many things that if they were, I hate to mention, they ought to be consistent. No, I don't want them to be consistent. They're liable to be consistent. Yeah. We have a lot more work to do, so therefore we have to have more and more regulation. Here they're saying that we have this problem. It's emotional. It's horrible. We need more regulations that's going to solve the problem. I think my bottom line is, if you resort to regulations, you'll probably create more problems. You'll undermine liberties, and you will not solve the problem of the shootings. Your statistical report there, I think, verifies that.
And Professor Fox is interesting because who did this study. You read what he wrote. He's not against gun control. Matter of fact, he's in favor of gun control. He strikes me as kind of a typical liberal professor. But here's what he said. He's in favor of gun control, but he says, in these measures, they will not prevent school shootings, these kind of measures that they're talking about, because they're already very, very rare. He says this kind of school shooting, these mass shootings, are so rare that these additional measures won't do anything to prevent them.
I can't help but think that it's much more difficult to provide safety in a school. The bigger it is, I think, the more difficult it is. And the schools are so big and gigantic, and just and I don't know whether it could be verified by statistics, but I would think a school that has 300 people would be easier to manage than one that has 3,000. Yeah. I think if you have 300, everybody knows everybody by their first name. And, of course, the other example when it comes to schools is, private schools, you don't read or hear about this. And, of course, some people argue that when you put up a sign as a gun-free zone, that might motivate them. I never know whether they have proof of that, but it certainly looks that way. That usually when there's no guns, we end up seeing some of these mass shootings. But I think it's tragic that this happens, because I happen to believe that some of the private industries and private schools and all, it's not like they don't care. They usually have some type of protection, that they can provide. So even I was just sort of pondering the thought, what if you did have a big school? And instead of depending on the sheriffs, that you wonder, are they qualified and will they really, defend the kids and this sort of thing? What if there were private groups that go in there? They do it for industries, and they do a pretty good job. I would visualize if you had a private security force, and they were responsible for the security of these schools that they could hit, they would be rewarded. They're getting paid to do it. And maybe more people would want them. and they would have a strong motivation. But I don't think we're on the move. It's likely to happen, but I think it's worth thinking about because private industry a lot of times can do a better job than the bureaucrats, and certainly the bureaucrat who wants more laws. I just don't think that's the answer, especially when it so explicitly violates one of the most straightforward amendments we have to the Constitution. They just want to throw this out. But this is real challenging because a few years ago, I was under the impression that the Democrats don't even talk about guns anymore because they always lose the fight, and then all of a sudden it's up front. And it's a big issue again. But what did we see in the papers after this happened? When the dust settled for about one day, then they had a gun show or a gun store, and more people there than ever.
Oh, yeah.
And yet, what were you hearing on TV? 78% of the American people want more controls and get rid of the guns and more registration, which was more of that propaganda, by the far left. And it had nothing to do with really caring. And my other argument that we've made before, if they really care about the children, they would think about how many children die at the hands of our foreign policy, whether it's the drones and the bombs we drop on them or the sanctions that we put on them. I mean, that is what they would have to care about if they really care about children who suffer the consequence, and those who start suffering the consequence of guns and bullets and bombs, government. Yeah. So, and if you compare that to a decreasing amount of school violence here locally, then the real problem is so often government guns when you look at it as a worldwide event.
And, the other proposal now is to prohibit those between 18 and 21 years of age from purchasing what they call assault rifles, just high capacity rifles. But here again, Professor Fox says, in the past 35 years, there have been only 5 cases where someone between the age of 18 and 21 used an assault rifle in a mass shooting. So very, very rare. 35 years, only 5 cases. Our old coworker, Penny Langford, posted something on Facebook today, and she pointed out, if you do this, you're going to prevent every young gal on a college campus who may want to have a handgun to protect herself from having a gun. And how vulnerable if someone who's trained, someone who can protect themselves, that seems a very, very unfair thing to do.
Yeah, they talk about the equalizer for women. A little pistol in their purse certainly makes them an equalizer to some thugs on the street.
Yeah.
So I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. I imagine this issue will be around for a while. I think it has to be dissected out in a practical manner, whether the stories and the statistics you hear are correct, and also to look at it in a practical way of do more regulations really help, and also in the area of rights. Who has a right to own a gun and protect themselves, and does it help to undermine that right? Obviously not. I think the founders were right. The right to own and use a weapon, that right should not be infringed. And I believe the country would be better off, and the founders certainly believed that that would be the case, and that's why they gave us the Second Amendment. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.
Ron Paul Liberty Report, RonPaulLibertyReport.com, and Ron Paul Liberty Report on YouTube. Check them out, subscribe. Now, a lot of people are saying Trump was just throwing a bone at the Democrats. He was just, he's not really going to do it. Still, you even if that's the fact, by saying that, you alienate a whole bunch of your supporters. And then if you do nothing, and a lot of probably his supporters and others probably went out and bought, guns, like, that report was saying the gun store was packed, bought ammo, bought guns, bump stocks. I'm sure those are sold out. Then, you have these stores making these decisions. I'm not going to sell to, anyone under 21 now. And this goes back to something I've been talking about for so long. And it's one of the number one things that irritates me about society today is the way that the youth is treated. And a lot of it is propped up by government. They put laws to protect children in place, but those laws also prevent younger, matured individuals to be able to work. There are loopholes for certain things where children can do things, but in today's society, the best thing is them just being smart enough to create something and their parents, get behind them. Because, even when I was young, I wanted to work before I could. There were actually 2 places that hired, I think it was 14 at the time. There were only 2 places that I could find in town that even hired at 14. Of course, because of the laws, I think it was the only I could work I want to say it was an hour and a half or something at the time. I can't remember right offhand. But that's why, no one wanted to hire anybody at that age, because who needs someone to come in for an hour? There's a lot of jobs out there that, an hour, well, it's going to take you about 15 minutes to get set up. And it's probably going to take you another 15 minutes, so we'll get a half hour's worth of work out of you, basically, of actual production. Not usually worth it. But there were a couple places, but of course they hire one person at each place. Couldn't get in. You treat some of these young people like children. And, I know people that really coddle their kids. And then I know I even have a family member that really educates, and they even go to public school. But the parent has invested so much time in education at home that they are extremely smart, but also see the views of the, other side. They tend to be more conservative because of their own views, because they were taught this way at home. They were taught to be open-minded and see the other side too. So they naturally just kind of look at what they believe they see that works. And at a young age, they're really, really educated, mature. And I look at history, and we have 25-year-olds, 27-year-olds, 28-year-olds that aren't as mature or well educated as people in their late teens, early 20s. in the past. It just, there's something missing there. And what we do and what government does, basically, is they've constantly passed laws. Well, we'll put a age limit on this. We'll put an age limit on that. We'll put an age limit on this. Okay, we've done this for, ever since I was a kid. I know people older than me say it's been going on, since they were young too. Law after law. Has the maturity level gone up or has it gone down? Has the intellectual, young person, has that gone up? What I see is a lot of emotional and theoretical beliefs, but no factual, we can't look at facts. If you bring up the facts, that counteracts, but, that's all fake. We see it from both sides. You have the, alt-right versus the alt-left. And it's gotten to a point where a lot of rational thinking is out the window. I see people going, I'm going to keep supporting Trump. Oh, he's just playing the Democrats. I don't know if he is, but I'm not going to support what he said just because, he might be, just playing the Democrat. No. You call him out when he's wrong. And, Ron Paul talked about, the Second Amendment. Yeah, it's one of the most upfront amendments. There's no but or unless about the Second Amendment. It says the right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed. It's pretty point blank period. I have an article here from Reason.com. Are we experiencing peak gun rights? A look into a more restrictionist future for the Second Amendment. We may have reached peak gun rights. History could well record that in the modern era, the Second Amendment received its most generous reading in 2010 when the U.S. Supreme Court decided it's the last major case and that gun rights have been declining ever since. This prospect is as worrisome for anyone who takes an expansive view on the Second Amendment, as it must be exhilarating for anti-gun advocates. Since 2010, residents of California, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Washington, Colorado, Oregon, and states with similar-minded legislators have found themselves slapped with new restrictions that did not exist 8 years ago. The U.S. Supreme Court has done precisely nothing to stop this extra-constitutional adventurism. Meanwhile, attempts to liberalize gun laws in the U.S. Congress have run aground. The U.S. House of Representatives approved concealed carry reciprocity last year, but both it and a related bill remain stuck in the Senate. A hearing protection bill modeled after similar laws in Norway and Denmark that deregulated suppressors for firearms has been waiting for a House vote since last September. So has another House bill that would curb overly broad state and local restrictions on rifles and shotguns. After President Trump's brainstorming session with Senator Dianne Feinstein this week about new firearm restrictions, the political outlook has darkened. Instead of working to advance pro-gun rights legislation. However, fitfully Second Amendment supporters are now trying to imagine what form a restrictionist proposal, possibly written by Feinstein, author of its 1994 ancestor, might take, and precisely how confiscatory it will be. Trump's remarks also invite speculation about what kind of Supreme Court justice he might appoint should another vacancy happen. Trump seemed to backpedal on Twitter yesterday morning and later announced that he had a great meeting with the NRA that evening. Perhaps he was reminded that if gun owners choose to sit out the 2020 election, this particular chief executive would not expect a second term. But without clear direction from the White House and without a president willing to devote the energy required to advance good legislation, the Second Amendment's legal protections are likely to continue to shrink. Most of the blame should land on the shoulders of supermajority of the Supreme Court justices in 2008 District of Columbia versus Heller and 2010 McDonald versus City of Chicago cases. The court declared the Second Amendment to be a fundamental constitutional right that states and municipalities must respect. After that pair of decisions, courts were supposed to review laws restricting gun rights with the same reflective skepticism as they would laws that restrict free speech or abortion. That did not happen. A series of lower courts, in particular U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, creatively interpreted those important rulings into near novelties, effectively overruling the Supreme Court. Bizarrely, at least 6 justices have decided to let them. It takes 4 votes to accept an appeal to overrule a lower court, and those 4 votes have not been forthcoming. If a lower court treated another right so cavalierly, I have little doubt that this court would intervene. Justice Clarence Thomas wrote in last week's dissent from his colleague's decision not to hear the Sylvester versus Harris case from the Ninth Circuit. But as evidenced by our continued inaction in this area, the Second Amendment is a disfavored right in this court. The right to keep and bear arms is apparently this court's constitutional orphan. Justice Neil Gorsuch joined Thomas in another dissent last year that made a similar point. You can read the rest of that at reason.com. So, it really seems to me they're waiting to rule on something when they have the ability to rule against it or limit it. Because based on previous rulings, they should be able to take up these cases and be like, okay, we've already ruled on this. We're going to stick with our ruling. You can't do that. just amazes me at how our system is not working anything like it was designed. Congress gives up half of its rights to make decisions to the president, or the president gives half of his duties to the Pentagon. Let's give the Federal Reserve one of the duties of Congress. Courts are actually making laws. They're the whole point of the Supreme Court is to have constitutional judges. That is their number one job. Is it constitutional or not? The thing is they're not supposed to make law. What they do is go, it's unconstitutional. You have to throw out that law now. Other states have to look at laws if they have them that is like that and throw those out. Doesn't mean they can't write a new law and hope that new law is constitutional. But what do? They keep enforcing, not review. And then the Supreme Court just sits back and watches. I think there's lower judges that couldn't the higher courts hold in some type of contempt when they continue to enforce laws that have been ruled unconstitutional. You can't enforce that law no longer. Can't do it. And if you write a different law, if it's anything, you just call it something else, but it's the same thing, we're going to take up that case again. Or any new law that violates the Constitution. But they really just ignore that. And, I have some constitutional beliefs. I have more of a libertarian belief system, though. I'm not a part of the Libertarian Party. There's problems with the Libertarian Party. I'm going to get into that in a minute. But I have deep ideological beliefs in libertarian thinking. And I still believe the Constitution is a lot closer to a libertarian society than where we're at now because we ignore the Constitution. I'm willing to work to get to the constitutional point of it and then continue work. But, even from where we're at now, we're lucky to get to the constitutional part. Could we get a libertarian person? It's a possibility. I see something wrong with the Libertarian Party. A lot of people know where I've stood on the Constitutional Party, even though they do, spread a lot of that, but they go kind of anti-freedom on certain things that I don't agree with. But, I've been criticized for going, we could, go more constitutional. I say, well, we can have a radical change. But my question is, how does society react to a radical change? Does radical change cause problems? History has showed radical change causes a lots of problems. That's why they don't ever want to take away guns. They want to restrict. Because if you do it all at once, guess what? Rebellion. Well, if we can restrict, we might have something there. But even when you look at the Constitution, a lot of what's in the Bill of Rights, it's libertarian philosophy in there. Not all of it. There's problems with it. But it's definitely a path towards libertarianism from where we stand now. It's only one of many, but it's more. So I'm willing to work with that. But I think we have a problem with the Libertarian Party that is preventing deep ideologically believing libertarians from getting anywhere. The head of the Libertarian Party apparently is running as on some type of non-party affiliation in Arizona, but we'll kind of get into that. But I do want to get into one. It's kind of long, and I'm not going to probably play the whole thing, but it's really important. And this is Tom Woods and Stefan Molyneux, and it's about libertarians gone wrong. And Gary Johnson, he brought a lot of people to the party. But if anybody watched the last one, he wasn't libertarian. He hasn't been. Neither was his running mate. And sacrificing what libertarian means to win, is that a good strategy? I'm going to get into this. Libertarians Gone Wrong, Tom Wood and Stefan Molyneux. It's just something we need to talk about.
Doing well here with Dr. Tom Woods. He is a senior fellow at the Mises Institute and the host of the Tom Woods Show. We'll put links to all that below. He is a New York Times best-selling author and has published 12 books because, 11 would be totally lazy, including the most recently, Real Dissent, a Libertarian Sets Fire to the Index Card of Allowable Opinion and Rollback, Repealing Big Government Before the Coming Fiscal Collapse, as well as Nullification, How to Resist Federal Tyranny in the 21st Century. The website, of course, is tomwoods.com, and Thomas E. Woods, Thomas, Thomas E. Woods is the Twitter account. Tom, thanks so much for taking the time today.
My pleasure.
So let's chat libertarianism. See, it used to be libertarianism and the Libertarian Party, but I think we might have to replace the "and" with a little bit of VS dot, libertarianism versus the Libertarian Party. And the nomination of Gary Johnson was an interesting choice. But when I hear that the Libertarian Party has kind of disinvited, then reinvited Ron Paul, of all people, without whom there would be very little knowledge of the Libertarian Party, that they don't invite Ron Paul to speak, that they've had their goes at you and I think at me. It seems like things have changed. It was the first political conference I went to as a teenager, was a Libertarian conference, and I really liked libertarianism, and the Libertarian Party has done great work in outreach. But it seems like there's just been a bit of a leftward drift over the last 2 years or so. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, as with anything, very often the people at the top are the problem, and the regular people who are doing all the grunt work and thankless work at the bottom are just, they're the good people. And so I don't want to say it's all hopeless and everybody's bad. A lot of these people are struggling the best they can in the face of difficulties from the top. Now, let me say from the beginning that it was not my idea to start talking about the people running the Libertarian Party. I don't want people to think that I'm still in pain from their attacks on me and I'm losing sleep over this. I am not losing any sleep over it whatsoever. It's too bad that it happened, but, I'm 100% in the right, and they attacked me in an unprovoked way. I put that behind me. That happens all the time. When you're unfashionable, that just goes with the territory. It's fine. It seems to me that what's happened is it's not just a drift leftward, but it's also an extremely unhealthy desire to be accepted in the mainstream. Mm. And they think that the path to that is to purge unfashionable people. And even I'm an unfashionable person, and I've got, as clean an academic track record as you could have. I mean, PhD from Columbia, high honors from Harvard, academic periodicals published me, very prominently. I've had books published, by major publishers: Columbia University Press, Random House, Basic Books. I mean, so if I'm some extremist, then I must be the most successful extremist in the history of the world. So something doesn't quite add up here. So I think there's a lot of it that's like that. It's they want to signal to the world, look, we're good, decent people, so won't you like us, Mr. New York Times reporter, sir? And what they find, or won't you like us, opinion molders at Slate and so on? And what they find is that no matter how many times you throw somebody like Woods or Molyneux, whoever the sacrificial victim of the day is, to the wolves, no matter how many times you do that, they still don't like you. They still smear you. They still call you names. The second you say something like, we want to repeal Obamacare, even something as vanilla as that, they call you a Nazi, no matter what. So you can do this to us all you want. That's going to keep happening to you. And meanwhile, you're just alienating a lot of your regular supporters who want to say, but, okay, look, if there's something wrong with Woods, given that he opened for Ron Paul like a dozen times, and he did all these other things with Ron Paul, and he's endorsed by Judge Napolitano, whatever, then you're implicitly smearing basically everybody we admire. What's going on here exactly?
Well, there's the moving goalpost, of course, which is when somebody says, well, if you prove this, I'll accept your opinion. And then you prove that. And they say, OK, one more thing you have to prove. And you end up chasing them right off a cliff. So there's the moving goalpost and there's the moving gallows. And the moving gallows are the media saying, OK, purge this person and we'll love you. And then you're like, OK, fine. I like love. And I'm going to purge this person. Okay, well, that person, unfortunately, was associated with this person. So you got to disavow and purge this person, and then we'll love you. And, oh, wait, no. See, this person published an article that was co-sponsored by, and it never ends. And their goal is not to give you love. The goal is to destroy your cohesion, your organization, your principles. And it's like they've never read their Rand. You don't go around chasing the approval of bad people and think you're going to end up in a good place.
And not just bad people, people who can't stand the sight of you, people who want to destroy you at the first opportunity. And moreover, think of the double standard at work here. Was the media morally outraged when Madeleine Albright casually said that we believe the potential deaths of 500,000 children connected to the sanctions policy in Iraq was, quote, worth it? We believe the price has been worth it. Now, if you or I said something like that, now, of course, nobody cares about Iraqis. That's one of the rules of American society. You're not supposed to care about civilians in any conflict the U.S. government is involved in. But let's say that there was some humanity in our media. If you or I said that, we'd never hear the end of it. We'd never be invited to anywhere again. Our careers would be over. But she says it, and it's not even like they say, well, what she really meant was they just ignore it and move on. Mm-hmm. So why are you chasing after the acceptance of people who obviously are not really evaluating people according to moral principles? If that were so, Madeleine Albright's career would be destroyed. Bill Richardson, who said the same thing about the 500,000 children, his career would have been destroyed. Instead, they had cabinet level positions. They I'm sure make a fortune on the speaking circuit to this day. What they're looking to do is destroy people who represent an actual challenge to what they're saying. That is what it fundamentally comes down to. Now, that's not to say there aren't a few creeps you got to say, look, You're completely at odds with what we stand for. We're going to show you the door. But any criterion like that also includes Ron Paul is a little bit out to lunch. And then, by the way, they try to defend themselves. Well, you don't understand the way the speaking invitation process works. Well, whether I do or I don't, the point is their own people started bad-mouthing Ron Paul. Well, he doesn't really get what the Libertarian Party is about. Ron Paul doesn't get what the Libertarian Party is about, but some loser functionary nobody's ever heard of does? Well, then that's all I need to know about the party.
Yes, I remember the founding principles of libertarianism. It had nothing to do with small government, free markets, private property, and contracts. I remember the central emblazoned, written in dragonfire statement, which is, let's make sure we have really good speaking contracts. That's the goal. Everything else is expendable, but we want to have good methodologies. And the idea is funny because it's the old thing, like, be careful what you wish for, you just might get it. Because the Libertarian Party, of course, has been striving for relevance and striving for public recognition and so on. And I think they're starting to achieve it. And that's why they're now scared of the media. They weren't scared of the media when the media had nothing to say about them. But now that with the Trump thing, with this growing interest in pushing back against PC correctness, with all of the trolls / gods of chaos on the internet looking to disrupt the existing system, there's a lot of interest in libertarianism, which means that the cold, fiery Sauron eye of the media is now casting its way to the libertarians. And it's like they're like, appease. And it's like, no, that's not how you're going to win.
No, totally. And meanwhile, they're led to believe that if they just nominate former governors, then the media will go easy on them. And to some extent, they did, because the media was so anti-Trump and they thought they could build up the Libertarian Party as a counterweight to Trump. But for heaven's sake, I mean, again, the double standard with supporting somebody like Bill Weld is ridiculous. I mean, we could go through all the problems with Bill Weld, but to me, it's, Murray Rothbard used to say everybody is entitled to one deviation. But my view is that deviation probably shouldn't be support for probably the stupidest war in American history. I mean, is there anybody with an IQ above 90 who's still defending the war in Iraq, which had no good consequences, was based on nothing, involved a huge expenditure of resources, and Weld is trying to walk that back a little bit, but not. I didn't see him really going out of his way to beat his breast in public. So his deviation, they'll try to dig up an article I wrote 30 years ago or something about nothing, when I was in my old paleo phase, and they'll say, aha, this is who Woods is in 2018. Well, here's who Bill Weld was 5 minutes ago. And they say, well, nobody's perfect. Yeah, sure, he's chiming in with the entire media, because the media was for that war. Make no mistake. He's with the whole media and political establishment in supporting something that led to who knows how many deaths, anywhere from 50,000 to 1 million, and anywhere from 2 to 4 million displaced people. But hey, nobody's perfect. The double standard is unbelievable.
Well, there's this odd thing that's going on at the moment as well, which is when I show sympathy for the victims of totalitarianism, as I did for the people struggling against the theocracy in Iran, and when I point out that there are godforsaken concentration camps in North Korea and it's one of the worst countries in the world, suddenly I'm pro-war. And that to me is there's not even a close logic. Like, sympathy for victims does not mean, oh yes, let's nuke their oppressors. It's just like, this is horrible stuff. We do need to recognize how many freedoms and opportunities we have relative to the rest of the world. And I'll be damned, Tom, I will be damned if anybody steps between me and my sympathy for the victims of totalitarianism by calling me a warmonger. That is a heinous, heinous deed. And what on earth are we sniping in this area of the universe for? I do feel that we have some slightly bigger enemies out there that we should kind of unite to oppose.
Well, if I happen to know that my neighbor is, let's say, not the best mom in the world, and I say, oh, geez, that's too bad for her daughter, that, her mom is just, not connecting with her or something. Does that mean that I'm saying, therefore, the UN ought to come in and be the mom for this child and take this child out of the home? Just because I express sympathy for somebody who's in a pretty bad situation doesn't mean I want war, I want the U.S. government involved. And secondly, the point that I've tried to make is that Murray Rothbard was very much opposed to U.S. Military intervention during the Cold War, for strictly ideological reasons, but also strategic ones. I mean, you could say that given that the Vietnam War ended with Vietnam going communist way, It did not lead to the end of the world. Vietnam is not of strategic importance to the U.S. by any stretch of the imagination. It tore American society to the point where we've never recovered from that. It was a huge expenditure of resources. It screwed up the economy, something fierce. Maybe it would have been better just not to do it. And even if Vietnam had gone communist, it went communist anyway. We could have saved the money. So he was against some, but all that time he was still very anti-communist. He would come right out and talk about, the crimes of communism, how they come directly from the initial ideas of communism. They're not an aberration. He had no problem being both anti-communist and anti-militarist at the same time. So I don't see why I can't occupy that position today, or you for that matter.
Well, I mean, the idea that you can fight communism by taking over more and more of the economy with the military-industrial complex, it's like, I mean, that's insane. You cannot fight communism through a massive amount of military expenditures. The warfare welfare state that really grew up in the 60s and the 70s. You can't fight communism by expanding your own state control over the economy. I mean, that is ridiculous. The whole point of communism is you have a huge state control over the economy, and that's what happened in the 60s and 70s while we were supposedly fighting communism. Communism seemed to leap over the border and embed itself in academia and the media and Hollywood and everywhere, and it's like, how is this fight worthwhile? We supposedly smashed up all these communists, but then you turn around, it's like, well, lots of communists in America now, and the government is twice the size.
Well, if you can recall Milton Friedman's dictum that there's nothing so permanent as a temporary government program, we were told that the enlargement of the military was just temporary. Conservatives in the Cold War, like Bill Buckley, said this is just a temporary thing, and then we'll go back to being a normal country. No such thing. You get that kind of an entrenched interest group that exists for the sake of perpetuating its existence. They will find rationales for existing forever. And as I get older, I'm increasingly convinced that a lot of what we see in terms of foreign policy is a matter of interest groups within the military vying for power and influence. And it has nothing to do with, you actually think they're trying to keep you safe by intervening in Ukraine? I mean, you think that has anything to do with you and nothing to do with lining people's pockets? Come on.
Well, I would also say that one of the PR problems that libertarians have, because there's a lot of principle, a lot of abstraction, a lot of intellectualizing, which is fine. I mean, it's very, very important to have clear and consistent goals and ideals. But there is kind of a lack of heart problem that is perceived in libertarianism. And, this, well, you don't like the welfare state because you want poor people to starve, you cold, callous, Scrooge, miserly duck person. And so for me, when I genuinely feel sympathy for the victims of totalitarianism and hate what's happening to them, it's not like a huge-hearted thing, because to me that's like just empathy 101. But when I'm attacked by libertarians for showing empathy, I don't think they're helping the empathy image problem that libertarians have.
Yeah, yeah, I hadn't thought of that. Right. It's not to say that I do believe that our primary concern, because we have some control over it and because we're subject to it and because we're paying taxes to it, is the regime that rules over us. I mean, yours is Canada, mine's the U.S. I do get that. But at the same time, if by accident of birth I happen to be born in North Korea, the North Korean regime would be my primary concern. So if we do have some general concern for the run of mankind, it seems like we ought to be able to bleed over from one regime into the other in terms of how we're expressing our sympathy for people. So I agree with you on this. And I understand why our friend Michael Malice would write a book about North Korea, because this is not just another two-bit dictator. I mean, we are observing in the age of the internet, we're observing this astonishing throwback that is doing horrible things to a great many people. There should be a lot of attention paid to that. I mean, the state apparatus is, the state apparatus of North Korea is not friendly with the state apparatus of the U.S., but it's still a state apparatus, and that is what we exist to oppose.
Well, and it's funny because none of the communists in North Vietnam were indoctrinating American kids. Like, it's a different language, different culture, halfway around the world. Communication technology was much more primitive back then. It cost like $8 million to make a 3-minute phone call around the world. So what's interesting to me is that we're so dedicated to fighting communism. I was reading the stat the other day, Tom, that 40% of anthropologist professors are outright Marxists. So to me, it's like, okay, well, the North Vietnamese were not indoctrinating our kids. So if you're going to Can we just invade the anthropology department and liberate? I'm kidding.
Well, and you know what?
But that's where the virus is being replicated domestically. And it is socialist programs of, funding student debt loans or underwriting student debt loans, very socialist redistribution of wealth. There's a huge amount of propaganda about going to college. So we're delivering our children by the truckload into this indoctrination factories, and yet somehow you fight communism by fighting in Vietnam. I mean, this is, come on. I mean, I was being facetious, of course, about invading, although, no, I was being facetious about invading. But it's like that's where the real battle lies at the moment, and it just seems that we're turning on each other like a snarling pack of underfed dogs.
Yeah, we got to not be turning on each other. And there are few enough of us as it is. Although it's an interesting analogy, by the way, with the universities and foreign policy. My first principle is, first of all, don't subsidize evil. So if somehow the U.S. government is sending aid to some ragtag army that we think might be the good guys, but they turn out to be the terrorists, just first move is stop doing that. Before you even think about anything else, stop doing that. And likewise with the universities. I'm not saying we got to take over the universities and they have to require that you and I teach all the classes. How about just stop subsidizing them? Let's stop doing that. And of course, people they can't even conceive of this because they think people won't have skills if they don't go to universities, or they don't have skills because they're going to universities. That's why they don't have skills. They're not being taught skills in universities in the case of 80% of majors. But anyway, we'll have to have that.
I would actually argue that their skills they're removed. The skills are being stripped down. There's studies that say that after people study economics, they know less about economics than before they started. Yeah. I think it's actually they're stripping down people. You end up coming out of university not just with the opportunity costs of not having had the skills and experience and contacts and income of being in the workforce, but you're massively in debt and you've been taught to hate your ethnicity or your gender or your society or the free market, and therefore you're going to sit, with blue hair, tattoos, and a tongue ring across from some guy who you think is your evil oppressor trying to get a job when all you've been taught is that resentment is the key to economic productivity. I mean, to me, it's a human destruction device now. It's not even that they don't gain much. I think it costs them enormously.
Oh, yeah. There's a really neat new book by Brian Kaplan called The Case Against Education. It's very provocative. I love provocative titles. And he dismantles every argument you've ever heard made for the current education system. It does this for people, it does that for people, it does that for people. Without it, we'd have this, and this. He goes through it all, and nothing's left standing. But one of his points in one of his chapters, he goes through all this survey data where Americans were given simple, the most basic possible test in whether it's science, history, politics, whatever it is, and they get out half the questions right. And what he says is, given how simple these questions are, these people, in effect, know nothing. And given that they're multiple choice questions, they're going to get 25% of them right anyway. He says, this is like people who know half the letters of the alphabet. We don't say they're half literate. They're not literate. They're illiterate.
Right.
And so imagine, I always try to point out the double standard that exists in the way people think about the private versus the public sector. If the private sector had generated a result as embarrassing as this, where the products of their system are this ignorant, this completely incapable of functioning in the current economy. People are sitting around saying, it's a tough economy out there. It is a tough economy out there because everybody's being trained as if it's 1957. Yeah, it is going to be tough. If you get a piece of paper where you studied sociology and you're sitting at home waiting for the phone to ring, then it's a tough economy. But in the age of the internet, where all you need is a camera and a YouTube channel and you can reach the whole world, that's a tough economy. It's only tough because no one's teaching them anything. So if the private sector had done that, we would never hear the end of it. Oh, all they care about is the rich. They don't care about helping the poor. The poor are suffering more than anybody under the current system, and all they can think to say is, maybe we haven't given them enough money. If Walmart were running the schools, do you think they'd be saying, maybe we haven't given Walmart enough money? They'd say the whole thing can't be fixed. It's perverse from the heart of it. So this double standard makes it impossible to think. I think I've taken us on a bit of a tangent.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to mention that the accessibility of being able to talk to the world literally turned me from a crazy person into somebody with an intellectual career.
Into a crazy person who reaches a lot of people.
No, because I would go down to the basement and just scream at the world anyway. But eventually you just turn on a camera and you go from a crazy person to somebody with an actual intellectual career. It's a miracle. It's a miracle of transformation. So let's talk a little bit about some of the libertarian think tanks that kind of cluster around this as well. It has always struck me, and I hear the click as I stand on the landmine, but I'm going to say it anyway. It has always struck me that people who say the free market brings efficiency, the free market brings focus, the free market brings excellence. So I'm going to go get all my funding from some big giant guy who's probably a capitalist, who's getting some benefits from some government monopoly. And I'm not going to face the market. I'm going to face my donor who is benefiting from mass immigration and the low wages it provokes. And I'm going to, talk about open borders as if it's just, well, obviously it's 2 and 2 make 4. How is it possible to hold this double think that you need the free market to be efficient, you need to satisfy your customers, and then not face your customers, or rather face one customer, which is a corporate crony capitalist for the most part?
Well, I will say this. I mean, I'm not a fan of the think tank model for reasons I'll say in a minute, but the voluntary sector is still under the general umbrella of the free market because it does involve voluntary transactions. Just like there are some people I think who think Christmas is socialist because you give things to people, but you're giving of your own private property.
It's true, yeah. It's not a coercive relationship,
yeah. Yeah, right. But I get what you're saying, that the fundamentals of it mean that, like, for example, it's possible for academia also to be entirely free market, but the way it actually works out, it's a lot of people who are not ever really subject to a market test, especially once they get tenure. Just like at a think tank, you got the big donor. You can just do what you want. You don't have to worry about justifying yourself. Well, here's what we did over the past year. Here's our report showing all the effectiveness we had. Yeah, I think that is an issue because, first of all, I think just on their own terms, I don't think these think tanks have a lot to show for themselves. In what way have they pushed back and repealed things that should have been repealed, or stopped things from being passed that were being passed? The Heritage Foundation would be an example of a conservative one, where my friend Michael Bolden over at the 10th Amendment Center came up with this brilliant idea. He says, we got all these, well, this is my paraphrasing of him, but we got all these think tanks who write policy reports all day that wind up in the garbage can. I mean, there's no congressman who reads a policy report and says, Eureka, I had no idea. I'm actually hurting people. I intend to help. Yeah, like that ever happens. How about we try something that's hands-on and practical? So Michael said, we have this gigantic NSA, National Security Agency facility in Utah. And it turns out that just to cool its computers, it requires, I believe the figure is, it sounds hard to believe, but 1.7 million gallons of water a day. And Michael said, what if we just cut off the water? What if Utah just said, we're not going to supply you with the water? That would make it impossible to run that facility. And there's nothing in the Constitution, even if you care about the Constitution, there's nothing in there that requires Utah to provide water to the NSA. And so he came up with this campaign called Off Now. He got interviewed on CBS News. He was in all the major newspapers all over the world for this one thing. And who couldn't have been more against it? This whole approach of the states saying, maybe we can try and stop this behemoth. I mean, my view is the states are terrible too, so they might as well at least do something good, stop the federal government. And the think tanks this is more than any think tank has ever done. This one idea cooked up by one guy in his living room, and yet if you talk about the states pushing back, they think, isn't that like slavery? I mean, you get this third grade response. I heard the states are kind of like slavery. You can't even have a conversation with these people. Yeah, let me get back to my policy report about nothing.
Well, but to be effective is to be attacked. And I think that, to push a bunch of paper around and to preen about your moral purity in the mirror while collecting a fat paycheck for often delivering freedoms to capitalists, as I mentioned in my perspective. But if you are actually effective, like, can you imagine if somebody actually did that? And wow, 1.7 million gallons a day?
Yeah, it's crazy.
I mean, I've heard of freedoms being extinguished in a whole number of ways. I've never actually heard them being drowned, but I think I have now. But I mean, if you were to do something like that, everybody knows that if you're effective about something, you're going to get the blowback. And that, I think, is what they most want to avoid. And to me, it's like you can't be in the war if you never want to go near a bullet. I mean, you can, but you're just not really in the war. And the reality is that if you do stuff that becomes effective, if you actually change people's lives for the better, if you help to change something in the world for the better, then all the people who benefited from it being worse are going to have you in their targets. And it seems to me that they want to just throw stuff randomly and hide in a ditch. And that is not the kind of moral courage that we need to save the world.
Well, in my case, again, I want just for my own listeners to know, I know I've already talked to you guys about this, so don't think I'm obsessing about it, but just for the sake of completeness, I should say that one of the things that I was taken to task for was a few libertarians nobody's ever heard of came up with a petition asserting that libertarianism is opposed to fascism. Okay, well, to me that's pretty obvious, because if you know what fascism is, and
I know. Let's have a petition that links the word libertarian with fascism, because that's exactly how people think. Oh, well, they must be completely different. Well, yeah, exactly. Why would you want to oppose it unless it was imminent or somehow close to your organization? Anyway, never mind.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are people who have ideas that these guys don't believe it, that don't agree with, but they're not fascism. Whatever you want to call them, they're not fascism. Because fascism is actually a very specific set of ideas. And I've talked about it on my show and explained. And, I had Lou Rockwell on, and we talked about what's wrong with fascism and why it goes without saying that we're against fascism. But when we started to see people on our Facebook feeds whom we had known from the Ron Paul movement who came out and said, Bernie has some pretty good ideas. I didn't see anybody urging me to sign a petition against socialism or communism. I didn't see that, and nor would I want to, because I think this is just drama queen BS that satisfies people who are of no significance, whom no one has ever heard of. It satisfies them, but again, does it satisfy the media? The media can say, oh, well, okay, that goes to show the libertarians are okay people. It makes it worse, because you're associating fascism, and the whole thing is stupid.
And sorry to interrupt, but there's a really frustrating thing, too, which is if I say, I'm against rape in Maine, then there is this kind of implicit thing. It's like, wait.
Does Maine have a particular problem with it?
Well, no, or also like, well, if you're not in Maine, woo, go to town, right? And so this thing is like, if leftists were taking over the Libertarian Party, that's exactly what you would expect. Because leftists, of course, the communists are anti-fascist in the same way that one crime gang is against another crime gang. They'll both unite against the police, of course, just as people unite against true freedom thinkers. But being against fascism means a little bit like, well, relative to communism, we're against fascism. Communism is pretty much okay. How about just we're against the initiation of the use of force? We're against violations of persons and property, and that encompasses the whole thing. But I do not like this. Well, that specific thing is my enemy because it gives an implicit approval to other things.
Yeah, I agree completely. So I just refused to sign. I thought it was stupid. I thought it was a dumb.
Tom Woods is pro-fascist because he refused.
Yeah, I know exactly. I thought it was a dumb attempt at publicity, or really what it was an attempt to smear certain libertarians implicitly by saying that you're going to be suspect unless you sign this petition. So if you say that to me, there's no way I'm signing. I am not even going to consider. That is not happening. And so there was, first of all, the sense of humor that people who impose petitions like this on the public, they're not known for their sense of humor. Let's put it that way. So when I just said, look, that's just not happening. Over on, can you believe this? On Twitter, the head of the Libertarian Party was saying things like, well, I guess that speaks for itself. That I won't sign a petition. I mean, when everything I've ever stood for, my entire body of writing, which is pretty substantial, my over 1,000 podcast episodes, 1,100 podcast episodes, all of this is against that whole mentality of imperialism, the leader principle, any kind of controlled economy whatsoever.
Yeah, public ownership and private profit, which is sort of the definition of fascism. Of course it's all. And the thing is, too, I hate to shock everyone, a petition is not an argument. If all you have is a petition, you're saying, well, we have a whole bunch of people who are nodding in a row, and that's what we bring to the table. If you have a good enough argument, a minority of one is a majority of truth. And this really is frustrating, that the idea that, oh, well, let's just get a whole bunch of people. And the other thing, too, Tom, it's like, sign this petition that's not an argument, get in line with everyone else, or we're going to destroy you. It's like, I think that seems kind of fascistic in a way, come to think of it. Yeah. I don't think that you're really achieving what you want to achieve.
So I don't do stuff like that. And so so I didn't do it. I took some heat from people I don't care about. And my own people, 99.9% of them, rallied to me and said, don't listen to these creeps who have accomplished nothing, and they're going to have some moral test for everybody. I mean, get out of town. I mean, half of these people have no problem with Bill Weld, and they're going to be lecturing other people about purity. No, just don't do it. So I didn't, and I still have a very, very comfortable life with lots of people who love what I'm doing. Doesn't matter. Makes no difference. That's another liberating thing about the internet. It just doesn't matter. And if I may just say, just very quickly, Stefan, in late September of last year, now I know for you 1,000 podcast episodes is like, I did that 15 years ago. But for me, it's a big deal. For me, 4-figure total of podcast episodes actually is a big deal. So I had a live event in Orlando, and it was on the same day that Hurricane Irma smashed into town. So we had to reschedule, and rescheduling something is the worst because, half the people can't come, and it was just horrible. And even one of my speakers couldn't come. It was terrible. And yet, even with the rescheduling, anybody who's in event planning, a lot of times you get invited to these events, and people say, come speak at our event. We're going to have 500 people there. And I say to them, I'd love to speak at your event, but you're going to have 150 people. They say, oh, no, that's not true. We're going to get 500. They've never organized an event. They have no idea what's involved. And sure enough, I've shown up, and it's been on the nose, 150 people. Now, sometimes I speak to big crowds, but those are seasoned people who know how to organize events. But the newbies have no idea what's involved. So we got about 600 people who came to my 1,000th episode, and every person involved in that 1,000th episode is an unapproved person. They were all unapproved. Eric July is unapproved. Dave Smith is unapproved. Michael Malice is unapproved. And I had a big video montage of people congratulating me, of Hans Hoppe, unapproved, all these different people, great folks. And yet we had more energy and enthusiasm in that, whereas I don't think 10 people would cross the street to listen to one of these think tank people talk. And when they do speak at a conference, half the time it's because their think tank subsidized their appearance to make it look like they have a big crowd coming to see them. Nobody comes to see these think tank presidents. That doesn't happen. So, it sounds like bragging because I guess it is. But when you keep getting smashed by moral pygmies all the time, when you didn't start anything and all the things you're doing are pro-libertarian, once in a while you want to say, hey, look, people, I did this with no institutional backing at all. I did this. There's no way. You people would probably slit the throats of your own grandmothers to get half of that. Get off my back.
Well, it's the old Superman movie. Like it ain't bragging if you do it. If you can do it and you're just telling facts, that's, right. That's not bragging. It's just and false modesty is just another kind of hypocrisy.
And by the way, it really is a testament also, if I may say, to the decency of the people who listen to me regularly. That they listen, they know the guy they're hearing. They say, this seems like an okay guy to me. So I think you have to be mentally deranged to think there's something wrong with this guy. And they've just stuck with me. They stuck with me, even though sometimes their friends probably hear something bad thing about me. And they just still do it. And I appreciate that, and there are a lot of them.
Well, and of course, if you were looking to be effective, you would look at the various freedom thinkers and freedom public intellectuals. And you'd say, okay, well, who has the most reach? Who gets the most views? And who has, with reasonable levels of intellectual integrity? The purity test is something that's but doesn't mean that there's no difference in levels of consistency. So who gets the most views and what's their model and how does it work? You would actually do your market research rather than just continue to do the stuff that doesn't work. And the market research shows that if you're customer facing, if you're driven by your listeners rather than one person, then you do much better. And they would all transfer themselves to that model, which would be in consistency with their market-facing ideas. Now, let's talk a little bit about something that I found quite surprising about libertarianism when I got into it more later, because as you know, I spent a lot of time in the business world and so on. So the libertarianism that I grew up with, it wasn't exactly monk-like, but it was pretty ascetic. And most of the early thinkers, I can't see Murray Rothbard with a joint. Like just in my mind and in my heart, like I can't see Ayn Rand drunk. Like I can't see that. And so the Friedmans and all of that, ascetic, intellectual, classy in a lot of ways. But then when I started getting more into libertarianism, go and give speeches and stuff like that, I don't know. It was like pretty hippie, pretty decadent, drugs, casual sex, and, I don't want to sound like too Victorian or anything like that, but there does seem to be kind of this heavy wave of people who are like, I don't like rules. I don't like consequences. I don't like, and it's like, I hate the government because there are restrictions on any of my behaviors, even though in a free society there would be restrictions on those behaviors anyway, because you wouldn't, you'd have to pay the consequences of your own bad decisions rather than foisting it off on the welfare state and socialized medicine and all that kind of stuff. There is something quite fascinating that seems to be growing, which I do associate with the left. The left and hedonism. They go from this wild hedonism, which is what they promise, and then they pull you devil-like into this layer of totalitarianism where you end up with a whole lot less hedonism than was promised. But that's kind of like the anglerfish light that they use to snap you up. But there does seem to be quite a lot of this anti-intellectual hedonism that's going on that does not seem in line with what drew me to libertarianism in the first place.
I think it just goes to show a lot of people are drawn for a lot of different reasons. And if you're drawn to it because you just hate authority or you hate rules, you're going to be an extremely confused libertarian thinker, because I believe in authority. It just depends on what the authority is and did I voluntarily consent to it. So I always use the example of the president of the chess club. The president of the chess club makes certain decisions about the club, and I have no problem with that. I mean, that's how the thing functions. I'm not going to come in and pretend to be the president of the club. And likewise, we would have rules. Of course, we'd have laws, or at least we'd have a legal regime, certainly. And even in I hate homeowners association examples, but you can imagine in principle a decent homeowners association where they would say, look, after 11 o'clock, we don't want you shouting about the Fed through your bullhorn. Go to bed. There's nothing wrong with that. Everybody voluntarily consented to that. So that's why I don't want to mention her name, because I think she maybe had second thoughts, but there was a woman who ran for the LP nomination for president who got upset at me because I made a video saying something like, look, anarchists should blah, 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 blah. And she said, talking down to me like I'm an idiot, I don't understand how you can put the word anarchists and should in the same sentence. And I thought, I don't understand how you don't get that.
Well, this is
I can't even say we should do something.
Well, anarchism, there's one R that they throw in there, right? So anarchism means without rulers. There's no centralized coercive authority. And one of the reasons why anarchism is so appealing is not only is it intellectually consistent, but also when you have a centralized pyramid of power in society, you have no rules. They change all the time. Just look at what happened with spying on the Trump administration and the lying about it and these allegations. The FBI is changing records and can't find. There's no rules. Look at the Clintons. So when you get this, you don't get rules. You just get chaos. And bribery and panic and manipulation and lies. And so that's no rules. So anarchism simply says without rulers, no rulers. But everyone takes that last R out and says, that means no rules. And it's like, no, we want rules. Right now we have no rules. In a free society, the rules are negotiated, they're consistent, they're the minimum necessary, they're constantly being whittled away as new technology arises and so on. And so this idea that anarchism means without rules, anarchism is the only way we ever get consistent, objective and rational rules in society. You're never going to get it through the state. It's too subject to the power principle.
And the funny thing is that, of course, really the idea that we believe in no rules is basically a left-wing caricature of what we believe. They say, you guys don't even think there should be, rules of the road or something. Well, it just depends on who the road owner is. But of course we want rules of the road. I mean, I would say, as you're driving down, you shouldn't be, you shouldn't be slashing people's tires when they're at the side of the road. Stuff like that. We agree on that. But when libertarians live down to the caricatures of them that other people come up with, that's what gets frustrating. When people say, well, all you libertarians are about is pot, I say, oh, come on, that's not true. And then I actually meet people like this. I say, oh, come on. Now you're making my job a million times harder. And I mean, it's not my thing. I'm not going to do it and, whatever. But there are, for example, you mentioned Gary Johnson, and maybe we should, circle back to the Libertarian Party in this respect. I get that if you were to say to the general public, we have to get rid of the whole drug war, that means all drugs. that a lot of people, fewer than before, but still a lot of people would find that horrifying and shocking. I get that. But we exist to horrify and shock because that's the only way you get people to change their minds. I mean, they're not going to listen to us to change their views that the capital gains tax should be 3% lower. They're already falling asleep. They're not even. But the way you get to people is by shaking them into thinking completely differently. The problem with being a milquetoast libertarian and saying, well, we should legalize pot and then, other drugs are a different matter, is that it makes it sound like libertarianism is really just your own personal habits with a philosophical rationale associated with it. It's not really a consistent set of principles. Whereas if I say about the drug war, we got to get rid of the whole thing, it's shocking, but at least people can say, well, I get why he's saying that, because his view is that people ought to be able to do what they want to do as long as they're not physically harming other people. At least I get where he's coming from. Whereas if you have somebody like a Gary Johnson who says we should legalize this drug, but this over here, now come on now, well then what's libertarianism all about? Just your personal preferences? Or likewise, that's the problem with on anti-discrimination law. I always point this out. Ann Coulter said that libertarians were a word I don't want to say, but it starts with a P, and it's not pansies, but it's a word like that. She said because they want to talk about how much they're in favor of pot, because they know they're not going to get in trouble. The New York Times is not going to come after them for that. But how come they don't talk about anti-discrimination law? Because they're going to get in trouble for that. Well, secondly, because they support it, a lot of them. Mm-hmm. They support it, even though it's against the idea of freedom of association. So if you're going to say, well, people should be allowed to form this kind of group, and that should be okay. But if they want to do that kind of group or exclude for that reason, we can't have that. Then again, libertarianism seems like this hodgepodge. You can't really nail it down. It's for this, it's not for that. I think the only way that's going to make sense is just to say, I know how unfashionable this sounds. I get it. I know the abuse I'm going to get for it. I know I'm not going to be Mr. Popularity. But having said that to you, now that I have the integrity to speak to you that way, I basically favor voluntary interactions for all people. And that means for scummy people too. They can have voluntary interactions too, and you decent people can have your voluntary interactions, and that's how we're going to interact with each other. I'm not going to try to make scummy people into decent people, because that's not my job, and I probably would do a lousy job of it. Maybe their friends can shape them up. I don't know. But I have more finite goals and expectations for my life. I just want my neighborhood to be pretty decent, or my state to be pretty decent, or my friends and I to be pretty decent. And I think we can get there by interacting on a voluntary basis with each other. And so
let's close with this, because this is something from my church days as a child and as a youth. There's something that was said to me that, it's like almost you go back in time. It's like my life would be so much easier if I'd never heard this statement. Like if my friend hadn't been into Rush and I hadn't got into Ayn Rand, and it was something that a priest told me. Oh, actually, he told the whole congregation. Because when it comes to moral rules, there are some that come easier and some that come harder, and they're different for different people and so on, right? The priest said to me, he said, Christianity is not a buffet. And that always really stuck with me, because it's not a buffet. You don't just get to pick and choose. It's the whole thing. And it's the same thing if you have these basic principles. My basic rule of the road is I don't want you to force me to fund your idea of a great road at the point of a gun. That's my first rule of the road, is I don't want to go to jail for disagreeing with how the road should be built. But this idea that principles are not a buffet, and you have to stick with the principles if you're going to have any credibility at all. The moment it becomes cherry picking, the moment you say, well, I like pot, I don't like heroin, so heroin should be illegal and pot should be legal, then you have just cast aside principle. Now, to me, if you're going to cast aside principle, why hold on to half of it? Like, why pretend? Just go merge with the general herd and do what you like. And of course, everybody ex post facto justifies their personal preferences according to some kind of principle, but forget even that. If you're going to have a principle, have a damn principle. And if you're not going to have a principle, then don't. But this halfway house stuff, all it does is it dissolves the credibility of those who actually have principles. And of course, now I'm thinking about it, maybe that's the whole point.
And I mean, I don't want to attribute motives to people that would involve reading their minds, because
I'm going to stop it there. It goes on for another probably 15 minutes or so. Now, when I looked at the Libertarian Party multiple times, and this started back 2006 or so, and what I found were a lot of people that were more interested in pushing to grow the party rather than really the beliefs of libertarianism. And then I also, had some of them, oh, you like Ron Paul. Oh, he's a Republican. Hold on, he's also a lifetime member of the Libertarian Party. There was a reason, and he stated multiple times why he ran as a Republican, to get that platform that the Libertarian Party can't grab. And if they're grabbing it by changing their belief system, then they need to change their name because their name won't match their ideology. If you're going to, even Ron Paul, when he ran as a Republican back in 2007 for the 2008 presidential election, even he claimed, you end the war on drugs, legalize all drugs. And, he got the feedback for that. He said, if we legalized heroin tomorrow, just because it's legal, are you going to run out and go get you some heroin? No. People that, want to experiment or to, get addicted to it, they're already doing it. And then, come to find out, we have a heroin problem now that's related to the opioid problem, which was a legal drug. But it was a prescription. And, well, when you go to the doctor, it's not like you're going down to, now states legalize marijuana. So you go down to the dispensary and get you some marijuana. And people are, doing it because they choose to do it. And you have this where you're going to a doctor and they're like, take this, take this. A lot of people trust in a doctor in a way that they don't tend to question as much. He's going to make me healthy again. Well, they just prescribe all these drugs that a lot of times in the beginning, they just go by what a journal says. Well, I don't know if they know, but those journals are usually funded by the pharmaceutical companies. So the articles in them tend to be very leaning, which they found that a lot of them tended to point to the random occurrence in a study rather than, the normal occurrence. Oh, we looked and we got it to do this. We got it to do it twice in 100 samples. That might not be the best result to go on. I have a lot of issues with that. But back to the libertarian thing, we see them go, oh, Ron Paul doesn't understand libertarianism. We vote for Gary Johnson. Excuse me? Really? Bill Weld? You're telling me those two people understand libertarianism? You don't like Tom Woods, but you like Gary Johnson. Are we talking about the Libertarian Party here? Am I missing something? I don't know, but I kind of got interested. So let me bring it back up here. I went to lp.org and I figured I'm going to go to the search bar up here and I'm going to type in Ron Paul. What happens when you go to the search engine and type in Ron Paul on the Libertarian website? And another thing is you can find them if you look for under their membership of lifetime members. But I looked and the last post was February 6, 2016, 2 years ago. Ron Paul, no one for libertarians to vote for in Republican or Democratic primaries. Ron Paul advised voters not to get behind any of the remaining candidates in either Democratic or Republican primaries on two Fox Business Network shows this week. Kennedy and Varney and Company host Stuart Varney asked Ron Paul now that his son ran has suspended his bid for the presidency, who is the remaining. It goes on, but that was 2 years ago. Before that, there was one on April 21st. Libertarian Party applauds Ron Paul suing IRS calls for end of income tax. 2012. Why no true libertarian, no true Ron Paul supporter, no true Tea Partier will even consider voting for big government Mitt Romney. Overwhelming majority of Ron Paul supporters will vote for Governor Gary Johnson. Gary Johnson, I have 2 words for Ron Paul. Thank you. And one about help Libertarian Party reach out to 13,000 Ron Paul for president activists in Tampa, Florida. LP Monday, this was 2011, message 10 Ron Paul questions. And this one, 2011, about the 10 Ron Paul questions. They question why Ron Paul isn't running on the Libertarian ticket. This is where I think there's certain people that were mad that Ron Paul didn't switch to the Libertarian Party when he didn't get a nomination. As in, run within the Libertarian Party. 2010 about Ron Paul praising. And you just look back and how they have their articles and the dates on them. And I want to say they've added some articles here that weren't here before. They might have hid some and brought them back. I don't know, but there seem to be new ones. But the dates, it's pretty weird what I've been seeing. But a lot of people have a problem with the leadership of the Libertarian Party. And it's pretty evident that they're not really looking at any type of libertarian type philosophy. They're looking to win. And what I'm looking at is what Gary Johnson and the leadership has talked about. And you don't catch it right away if you're just listening to them talk about their success. You think, oh yeah, they're getting bigger. Oh well, yeah, but they're getting bigger under a philosophy that's not libertarian. And listen what their goal tends to be, which I've actually talked about it, and at the time I didn't realize it, because it would be nice for them to be able to compete in the same arena with the Democrats and Republicans. It's not just getting into a debate that they talk about when it comes to winning. There was something else, and it was getting a certain percentage so they can get federal funding. Oh, they're chasing after the money. Now, when you're trying to push a libertarian philosophy into a political system that tends to be fighting against libertarian philosophy, your number one goal shouldn't be going after the money. Number one goal is stopping government from overreaching and taking our rights, creating a freer society. But their goal seems to be the money, to get subsidized. And get in the debates, which would be awesome. One organization I've talked about for, well, as long as I've done this broadcast, Free and Equal. Go check them out, Free and Equal. I really need to get in touch with them. It's been a while, so I'm not sure what campaigns or what they're accomplishing at this moment. I've had so much going on throughout the years, and you know how that goes. It doesn't end, so I've been a little detached from Free and Equal, but let me see if I can pull up their site kind of quick here. Okay, sorry about that. Says our mission is to broaden electoral choices through education and direct positive action. And I'm waiting for their campaigns. page to pop up. They are currently developing an election assistant app to assist and inform voters of all their candidate choices and valuable candidate data to help you make conscious voting decisions, not just from two parties. They want to build an independent candidate movement, raise political consciousness through education, promote cultural change through arts and music, get money out of politics, repeal Citizens United, encourage open debates, register to vote, encourage voting day as a holiday, support campaign finance reform, support alternative voting methods to discuss new blockchain encrypted online voting solutions, reform the electoral college voting system, eliminate superdelegate voting system, support shorter presidential election cycle, eliminate restricted ballot access barriers, support open primaries, eliminate gerrymandering, encourage open elections through proportional representation, support independent media, get involved, and support local elections. So hopefully they're able to get this app going, and they've always got little campaigns they have going on and events they have going on. Go check them out. freeandequal.org. I watched them pop up and grow, and it's been a hard campaign. They've had a lot of things they had to really overcome, problems with setting up events at the beginning, and at first it looked like they were going to just, go full out. But it seemed like there were maybe some powers to be that didn't want to see that happen and kind of put little roadblocks here and there. But that really hasn't stopped them. They have continued to grow. And what's really nice, too, is that they have really supported grassroots media. Okay, it doesn't look like I'll have time. I had a little minute clip I wanted to play, but it's okay. We will get to that probably next week. When we look at the 2020 elections, and if you look at any type of chance that Donald Trump might get reelected, it won't come if he passes restrictive gun, control measures. So I don't think it's going to happen, but the rhetoric still doesn't help his cause. It still makes people sour to him. And really, that's what probably upsets me about the Libertarian Party, because if he did something like that, the Libertarian Party needs a libertarian, true, rights-oriented, the idea of freedom-oriented, someone that could win the Tea Party, the Constitutionalists, someone that can appeal to that and appeal to the left that feel like they've been oppressed. But you have to fix the Libertarian Party. That actually happened. Stay tuned here on AC White on